Hi, and welcome to Mr. Fisher's Biology Podcasts. This podcast will address the age-old saying of survival of the fittest and what that means when an organism is fit, or looking at the concept of fitness. So, when we look at natural variation and artificial selection, the idea being that Darwin abandoned the idea after his trip on the Galapagos, and as his theory began to develop, that species were perfect and unchanging. Remember that this was the idea for many, many years, that species did not change. And what Darwin did was he observed variation in all kinds of species. And when he went home to England, he observed that farmers use variation all the time to improve crops and livestock. And we call this selective breeding. So for example, if we were to look at dogs, whether we're a Chihuahua or a other type of dog, they all are the same species, and it's just variation within that species. People have selected for the different breeds of dogs. So everything from Chihuahuas to Great Danes. So within an organism, there is natural variation. Nature provides variation. Within artificial selection, people use selective breeding programs to select that natural variation among stock or crops. So for example, within cattle, we're looking for particular traits. When we find those traits in a bull, we select and we use that bull to produce other offspring so that those offspring would have those traits. This is selective breeding. This is artificial selection. So the key concept to artificial selection is that nature provided the variation and humans selected the variation that they found useful. A very good example is this plant here. This is a brassica, or a ancestral mustard plant. Through artificial selection, humans have selected different parts of the plant to produce very different types of vegetables, all descended from this common ancestral brassica or mustard. So we can use the bottom of the plant to produce kohlrabi. We find the leaves have been altered to make kale lettuce. A neat one, the lateral buds have actually been engineered through artificial selection to produce Brussels sprouts. And the head arrangements, the floral arrangements, have been altered to make things like cauliflower and broccoli. And so this is an example of artificial selection. All of these organisms come from one common ancestor that we have engineered. Nature provided the variation, but we select for the traits that we're looking at. So when we look at survival of the fittest and the idea of what is the fittest, we come to the idea of fitness. And fitness is the ability of an individual to survive and reproduce. And that the way that the individuals survive and reproduce are through adaptations. Adaptations are characteristics that increase an organism's chance for survival. We're going to look at some different types of adaptations that exist that would increase organisms' chances for survival. So we can have structural adaptations. So structural adaptations are differences in shape, arrangement, or of physical features. So for example, things like camouflage, claws, quills, blowholes in aquatic mammals like whales, mimicry, so the fact that all stinging insects have the same coloration patterns, that's a structural adaptation that warns organisms or warns predators that these organisms are potentially harmful. Another type of adaptation is physiological. This is variations within the organism's metabolic process. And a very good example of physiological is the antibiotic-resistant bacteria. So some bacteria may contain an adaptation that would give them resistance to a particular stream of antibiotics. And as those organisms are the only organisms able to survive and reproduce, we find that over time, all bacteria will develop a resistance to that strain, right? Because if you can't, you die and you don't survive. You don't have as high of a fitness as the resistant ones. Behavioral adaptations, how organisms respond to their environment. So for example, migrations are a behavioral adaptation. The fact that monarch butterflies fly every year from parts of Canada all the way down to parts of Mexico in order to overwinter is a really good behavioral adaptation. It allows them to survive in an environment that's a little bit warmer. Same with birds, same with caribou. It allows them to take advantage of food sources that they normally wouldn't have in the winter, increasing their fitness. Hibernation. So if you're a bear or if you're a snake, it's more advantageous for you to hibernate than to have to go out and forage in the wintertime. This is another adaptation. It increases your rate of survival and able to reproduce. Same with the shedding of leaves. So for some trees, it's energetically taxing to keep leaves on in the winter, and so they will shed those leaves and they're able to overwinter that way. So fitness is central to the process of evolution. The idea being individuals that have low fitness will either die or will produce few offspring. And this is a key point to the idea of the survival of the fittest and evolution by natural selection. So that concludes the podcast on the survival of the fittest.